Okay, so tonight is a continuation of last week's, which was the Feast of Passover. So we're going to do all the feasts, but first we're doing the ones in the springtime, which is Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and First Fruits. So tonight we're going to cover the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So I'm going to read just a little bit about their last day in Egypt because it has something to do with this feast being inaugurated. This is Exodus 12:29. And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on the throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the prison, and all the firstborn of cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night. I want you to realize the death angel came by at midnight. That's when Passover happened. And so there was such mourning in Egypt. There wasn't one house where there wasn't somebody dead.
Jeez.
And his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. That's just what I said. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go and serve your Lord as ye have said. And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We all be dead. They're thinking, is this death just going to end with the firstborn, or are more people going to be killed? So they were afraid. And, you know, even Pharaoh's throwing them out. And when Moses first came to Egypt, he said, Let my people go. And now Pharaoh's saying, Get out. Get out now. We're done. This death of the firstborn, which the firstborn of Pharaoh would be the next Pharaoh, which is a god. Their Pharaoh was considered God. And the people took their dough before it was leavened. This means before they had put the leaven in it. And their kneading troughs, being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. And they asked the Egyptians for jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. Now I want to tell you where that promise came from. That was something that God had promised Abraham way back when he made his first covenant with Abram. His name was Abram at that time. And the Lord said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. That's Egypt. And shall serve them. That means they're going to be slaves. And they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. That's what he did with the 10 plagues. And afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. God himself is prophesying this. And that's what happens. They just give them this stuff. Well, I'm going to read verse 36. And the Lord, Yahweh, gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted unto them such things as they requested, and they plundered the Egyptians. So what's happening here is they probably at this point, when they're thinking about life and death, don't even care about their possessions. But God gave the Israelites favor, and so that they wanted to give them all of this wealth. And when you think about it, slaves for 400 years, it's like, hey, they got paid, finally. So they were thrown out in such a hurry that they had their dough, but they hadn't put the leaven in it yet. So I want you to remember this, that because the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb that was given the night before, that covered them from death. And then when they went out, they were thrown out in such a hurry, they didn't have time to put leaven in their bread. So that's going to have something to do with this Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yes.
What's leaven?
Leaven is yeast.
Oh. So what does that mean in their time? Like what?
It's the
was
same
it so
thing.
Important? Like what was
No.
important about it?
Okay. Well, in the Bible, leaven, which is yeast, it's often referred to as a type, even though there's nothing wrong with yeast. It's referred to as a type of sin because if you put it into something, it spreads all through the dough and changes it. Okay?
So that's matzah, right?
That's right. That is matzah. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men besides children. 600,000. They only counted the males that were over 20. So when you count all the other males and then all the women and the children, it ends up being 2 to 2.25 million people.
God.
Okay? And then in verse 38 it says, and a mixed multitude went up also with them. Okay, well, I want to talk about that mixed multitude. Think about these Egyptians. They've seen all of these miracles, these plagues, which are miracles. And maybe some of them are thinking, maybe that is the real God. Maybe we'll just go out with them. So they could have easily gone out because it says a mixed multitude, meaning it wasn't just the Israelites. And then you have the situation where you might have an Israelite marry an Egyptian girl. Or you might have an Egyptian man marrying an Israelite girl. You know how Romeo and Juliet, love has no boundaries. So these things happen. So now you've got people who aren't Israelites who may decide, I want to go. I believe that this is the real God and I want to go with these people. It looks like they're on the right page. So that's what that mixed multitude means. But as time goes on, this mixed multitude who are not the genuine Israelites, they're troublemakers. They're like, we want to go back to Egypt. We remember the fish. And so, not that the Israelites don't cause a lot of their own problems, but these people did too. In fact, in Numbers 11, 4-6, now this is when they're on their journey. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, and the children of Israel also wept with them. Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish that we did eat freely in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away, and there is nothing at all besides this manna. Okay, so God is sending bread down from heaven, and it's like, is that all we get? Really, this kind of complaining for people who don't have anything to eat. It's amazing. It's amazing. But anyway, back to Exodus. It said, a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, and very much cattle. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough, which they brought forth out of Egypt. For it was not leavened. That means the yeast, they didn't put the yeast in it. Because they were thrust out of Egypt and couldn't tarry. Neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. Okay, I have my theory about that word victuals. It means provisions of food. But whenever you watch the Clampets, they say victuals. And I think it came from this word victuals. I think it's a corruption of this word. I always wonder where they get that word victuals, and it means food. And then when I started reading this King James and it says victuals, I think that's it. Verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt in that night of the Lord, to be observed of all the generations of Israel in their generations. So, when they went out, I told you about Passover, how they went through the blood of the door. And then the very next thing that happened, they exited Egypt. That's why this book is called Exodus. It was their exodus out of that land. And that's why that is the name of this book.
Red Sea parted like a miracle?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a miracle altogether. But beyond that, they went on dry ground. Just think the waters part. You think, well, it'd be really damp for days, even if the waters were parted, for all that to dry out. But he let them go on dry land. And when they left, they took the bones of Joseph, because Joseph had asked them in the last chapter of Genesis. He got all of his relatives together and said, don't leave me here. Take me back to the promised land. And so he had been made into a mummy. So that made it really convenient to take his bones like that. But it's funny, whenever you see pictures or, things that artists have done, they never show those bones. They never show that. Anyway, so this night was to be remembered because this was a night they were delivered from their slavery. So I'm going to go to chapter 13 and start with verse 5. And this is where God is making it a feast. And it shall be when the Lord shall bring you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. The Jebusites were from Jebus, which actually became Jerusalem. Yeah, these Jebusites. Which he sware unto thy fathers to give it to thee, a land flowing with milk and honey, that thou shalt keep this service in this month. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and in the 7th day shall be a feast unto the Lord. Actually, when you go to Leviticus 23, where these feasts are stated again to the people, it tells you that Passover is on the 14th day in verse 5, and then in verse 6 it says, and on the 15th day, the very next day, is a feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. It lasts for 7 days, and on the first day is a holy convocation to the Lord. It's a Sabbath. There are other Sabbaths other than the 7th day of the week. A lot of these holy feast days have Sabbaths, and this has one on the first and one on the last, and it lasts for 7 days. So what does that mean? What does 7 mean? Completion. That's what it means. That's right. I told you about, when I was reading, that they were going to celebrate this also when they got into the promised land. So when they crossed the Jordan and they came into the promised land, they set up the tabernacle, and they came across the Jordan on the 10th day of the month. That's the day they're supposed to take the land. And then, I'll read this. This is Joshua 5, 9, and 10, and 11. And the Lord said unto Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Wherefore the name of this place is called Gilgal, which means rolling, unto this day. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, at even in the plains of Jericho. But this is what's really important. Verse 11. And they did eat of the produce of the land on the morrow, then very next day, after Passover, unleavened cakes. So they knew. They were celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's all we have about it. And roasted grain. So I wanted you to know that they had followed through, and they followed through all the way up to Christ. And then some kept, even though Christ was fulfilling these feasts, a lot of Jews just kept keeping them.
And Jesus was a Jew.
Absolutely. Right on. He was. Now I want to tell you about the fulfillment. Okay, they were slaves in bondage, and they were set free by killing the sacrifice of the lamb, and then they were able to walk out with their unleavened bread because they were thrown out in such a hurry. They didn't wait and say, well, wait a minute, I got to get my bread ready. Yeah. They went. After 400 years, they were ready to go. But so Christ did the same thing. When he died as that sacrificial Passover lamb on the cross, he set us free from the bondage of sin. That's what this story is all about. It's a type. There are so many types in the Old Testament, and they point to Christ. They're fulfilled in Christ. And so Passover, and then the very next day, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, how God got them out in a hurry, got them out of that slavery. And they were actually thrown out so fast that they ended up eating unleavened bread the first meal that they ate. Yeah. So
unleavened bread is sort of hard. It gets hard.
it is. It's just water and flour, and then they flatten it out, and then they'll put some like fork marks in it, prick it, and then put them in the oven or whatever. So that leaven is a symbol in the Bible for sin, and it represents how sin can spread and corrupt. See, because it has to actually corrupt the dough to make it rise. So there's nothing wrong with eating bread with yeast in it, and these people did all the time. And so in the Bible, before Christ is crucified, you'll hear them talk about the day of preparation, because they also were to eat the unleavened bread at Passover. So the day of preparation was when they got all the yeast out of their house. They couldn't even have one drop. So that's when they talk about that in the Bible, the day of preparation, that's what it means. It means that was a day where they got all the yeast out of their house. It was a symbol. It's going to be my lesson for tonight, and then next week, we'll start with the Feast of First Fruits. It's a very exciting feast and a very exciting fulfillment.